You know what's weird? An entire generation got told they were special, then worked harder than anyone expected, and somehow ended up unable to afford the same life that seemed completely normal just one generation earlier. That's a psychology experiment nobody signed up for. I'm talking about millennials, people born between 1981 and 1996. And before you roll your eyes, stay with me because this gets uncomfortable in ways you probably haven't thought about. Millennials became the first generation in modern American history expected to be worse off financially than the generation before them. The Pew Research Center confirmed this back in 2020, which means we've got an entire demographic walking around with this bizarre psychological cocktail of achievement and failure mixed together in their heads every single day. Imagine being told your whole childhood that you could be anything, win anything, achieve anything, and then graduating into a recession where the participation trophy suddenly becomes a master's degree that costs more than a house used to. The psychological term for this is cognitive dissonance, and millennials are basically swimming in it. We're not talking about a small group here. Millennials represent roughly 72 million people in the United States alone, the largest generation in the workforce right now. They're running companies, raising families, making cultural decisions, and yet there's this persistent narrative that they're somehow perpetually adolescent. But what if the psychology behind all of this isn't immaturity at all? What if it's actually a textbook response to a fundamentally broken system that promised one thing and delivered something else entirely? But here's where your brain should perk up, because this goes deeper than student loans and avocado toast jokes. Psychologist Jean Twenge literally wrote a book called Generation Me, studying this exact phenomenon. She found that millennials score higher on narcissism scales than previous generations. And this is the part that'll mess with you. They also score higher on anxiety and depression. So you've got a generation that simultaneously thinks they're special and feels completely worthless. A trauma response with a LinkedIn profile, the data backs this up in ways that are genuinely disturbing. According to the American Psychological Association, millennials report higher stress levels than any other generation currently alive. They're more likely to be diagnosed with depression and anxiety disorders. They're seeking therapy at unprecedented rates. And yet, when you look at their actual circumstances, none of this is surprising. It's not a character flaw, it's a completely predictable outcome of the environment they've been navigating. Dr. Twenge's research reveals something even more nuanced. The narcissism isn't the kind where people genuinely believe they're better than everyone else. It's what psychologists call defensive narcissism, a compensatory mechanism for deep-seated insecurity. When you're constantly told you're special but the world keeps proving you're expendable, your brain does something weird. It doubles down on the special narrative because the alternative, accepting that you're not special and you're also failing, is psychologically unbearable. So millennials present this outward confidence, this personal brand, this curated life, while internally they're falling apart. Instagram versus reality, but make it a generational coping mechanism. Think about the actual timeline here for a second. Millennials were the test subjects for every parenting trend that came out of the self-esteem movement in the 80s and 90s. Helicopter parents, everyone gets a trophy. You're smart just for existing. These weren't bad intentions. They were earnest attempts at better parenting based on the psychology available at the time. The idea was that building self-esteem would create confident, capable adults. And in some ways, it worked. Millennials are confident enough to question authority, to demand better working conditions, to speak up about mental health. The boomers who raised them had lived through an era where the formula actually worked. You could graduate high school, get a factory job, buy a house, support a family, and retire with a pension. That wasn't privilege, it was just how the economy functioned for the middle class. So when they told their millennial children, do better than we did, go to college, they genuinely believed they were setting them up for success. They had no idea they were handing their kids a roadmap to a destination that had been demolished and replaced with a toll road nobody could afford. Then millennials hit their 20s right as the economy imploded in 2008, graduated into a job market that had fundamentally changed, and suddenly found themselves navigating a completely different economic reality than the one they'd been prepared for. The whiplash alone should have hospitalized people. The Great Recession wasn't just an economic event, it was a psychological trauma for an entire generation. Research from the Stanford Center on Poverty and Inequality shows that people who enter the job market during a recession earn less money for at least 10 to 15 years afterward. Their career trajectories are permanently altered. Imagine spending your entire childhood being told that education is the key to success, taking on massive debt to get that education, and then discovering that the job you trained for either doesn't exist, doesn't pay enough to cover your loans, or requires 5 years of experience that you can't get because you just graduated. That's not laziness. That's learned helplessness, a psychological state where you stop trying because you've learned that your efforts don't produce the expected results. And social media millennials got that right in their formative years. Not as kids like Gen Z, but as teenagers and young adults when their identities were still forming. Facebook launched in 2004, Instagram in 2010. That means millennials learned how to be adults while simultaneously learning to perform their lives for an audience. Dr. Tim Kasser's research on materialism and well-being shows that when people base their self-worth on external validation, which is literally what social media trains you to do their mental health tanks, you're essentially running a 24/7 campaign for your own existence, and the polls never close. But here's the thing that makes it even more psychologically damaging. Millennials are old enough to remember what life was like before social media, but young enough that it became integrated into their adult identity formation. They experienced the before and the after, but they also had to adapt to a world where your professional network, your dating life, your social status, and your personal brand all live online. That kind of rapid adaptation creates cognitive strain that previous generations never had to deal with. The comparison culture that social media creates is particularly toxic for a generation already dealing with economic anxiety. You're scrolling through feeds watching your college friends buy houses, get promotions, take vacations, and even though you intellectually know that people only post their highlight reels, your brain still processes it as evidence that everyone else is succeeding while you're falling behind. Social comparison theory tells us that humans naturally evaluate themselves relative to others. When the others are a curated feed of everyone's best moments, your baseline for normal becomes completely distorted. Now, pile on the fact that millennials are delaying or completely skipping the traditional life milestones that used to give people a sense of adult identity: marriage, homeownership, having kids. Surveys show they absolutely want these things, but the economic reality makes them borderline impossible without family wealth or extraordinary luck. The median home price in the United States has increased by over 400% since 1980, while wages have barely kept pace with inflation. In many major cities, you need to earn well into 6 figures just to afford a starter home. The marriage and kids thing is even more complicated. Millennials are getting married later than any previous generation if they're getting married at all. The average age of first marriage has climbed to 30 for men and 28 for women, compared to 23 and 20 in 1960. But this isn't because millennials don't value relationships or family. Study after study shows they do. The issue is that marriage and children require financial stability, and financial stability requires resources that many millennials simply don't have. So you've got people in their 30s and 40s who still feel like they're waiting for their real life to start. Except the waiting room is a studio apartment that costs $12 a month and their therapist is booked until March. The impact of prolonged uncertainty is surprisingly well documented. When achieving the markers of what society defines as adulthood becomes unattainable, your brain doesn't just shrug and move on. Instead, it creates this low-level stress referred to as allostatic load your body, constantly preparing for something that never actually comes. Like being stuck in the loading screen of your own life, and when you look at the progress bar, it hasn't moved an inch in the past decade. Dr. Bruce McEwen's research on allostatic load shows that chronic stress, the kind that comes from long-term financial insecurity, delayed life milestones, and constant uncertainty, literally changes your brain structure. The hippocampus shrinks, the amygdala becomes hyperactive. Your body stays in a state of semi-emergency, pumping out cortisol and adrenaline because your brain has learned that threats are constant and safety is temporary. This isn't anxiety as a personality trait. This is anxiety as a reasonable biological response to genuinely unstable circumstances. But let me throw something at you that might feel a tad more personal. Millennials were sold a very specific story about how effort equals outcome. Study hard, go to college, get a good job, work your way up. That social contract seemed pretty straightforward, and honestly, it had worked for a long time. It was the American dream distilled into a simple formula. Your parents did it. Your grandparents did it. Why wouldn't it work for you? Except the economic landscape shifted in ways nobody really anticipated. When millennials showed up ready to follow that path, They found that college now costs 10 times what it used to. Entry-level jobs require 5 years of experience. And here's $80,000 in debt and a gig economy where you're an independent contractor with no benefits. The psychological term for when reality fundamentally violates your core beliefs about how the world works, Schema disruption. And when it happens on a generational scale, you don't just get disappointed people, you get a complete rewiring of how an entire age group relates to institutions, authority, and the concept of a stable future. Schema disruption is serious business in psychology. Your schemas are the mental frameworks you use to understand how the world operates. When a schema gets disrupted, when the world stops working the way you are told it works, your brain has to rebuild its understanding from scratch. That process is cognitively exhausting and emotionally destabilizing. It's why millennials are often characterized as both idealistic and deeply cynical at the same time. They still believe things should be fair, they just no longer believe they will be. Pattern recognition in action. This explains so much about millennial behavior that gets misread as entitlement. When millennials demand work-life balance, remote work options, mental health days, or transparent pay structures, they're not being unreasonable, they're rejecting a system that already rejected them. They watched their parents give everything to companies that laid them off without hesitation during the 2008 recession. They saw loyalty rewarded with pink slips and gutted pensions. And the job-hopping thing, man, millennials get absolutely roasted for not being loyal to companies. The average millennial changes jobs every 2 to 3 years, compared to baby boomers who might have spent a decade or more at a single company. Older generations see this as flaky or uncommitted. You know what's psychologically fascinating about that criticism? Corporate America fundamentally changed the employment relationship over the past few decades. Pensions disappeared. Full-time positions became contract work. Mass layoffs became normalized business strategy. Millennials didn't invent this lack of loyalty. They just adapted to an employment landscape that had already abandoned them. A completely rational response to an environment that treats workers as interchangeable parts. Research shows that the single best way to increase your salary as a millennial is to change jobs. Staying at one company typically results in 3% annual raises. Switching companies can get you 10 to 20% increases. When the system incentivizes job hopping, you can't blame individuals for responding to those incentives. But here's something that doesn't get talked about enough. Millennials are also one of the most educated generations in history and the most diverse. Nearly 40% have a bachelor's degree or higher, compared to around 25% of baby boomers, and they grew up with the internet, which creates a very specific psychological profile. People who question everything because they've seen 1,000 versions of truth depending on who's telling the story. Having unlimited access to information from childhood changes how you think. Millennials learned early that authority figures don't always tell the truth, that institutions can be corrupt, that the official story often has holes in it. They came of age during the Iraq War, where government claims turned out to be false. They watched the 2008 financial crisis reveal that the people running major institutions had no idea what they were doing, or worse, knew exactly what they were doing and didn't care about the consequences. People who interrogate the status quo often get labeled as entitled or difficult. But critical thinking meeting systems that were never designed to be questioned? Yeah, it's gonna look like that. When millennials push back on "because I said so" or "this is how we've always done it," they're not being disrespectful. They're applying the analytical skills they were taught to develop. The irony is that their parents told them to think critically, and now those same adults are annoyed that millennials are actually doing it. So what you got is a generation shaped by impossibly high expectations, economic instability, constant performance pressure, delayed adulthood, and a front-row seat to multiple overlapping crises. And they're also the generation that gets to watch the planet actively deteriorate while being told they're the ones who need to fix it, despite having comparatively less institutional power and resources to actually do anything at the scale required. Climate change adds this whole other layer of existential dread. Millennials are acutely aware that the planet is warming, that ecosystems are collapsing, that extreme weather events are becoming normalized. They read the science, they see the projections, and they're told that individual action is the solution, while corporations and governments continue policies that make meaningful change impossible. Existential dread with a side of helplessness. Climate anxiety is a legitimate psychological phenomenon now, and millennials are right in the crosshairs. The American Psychological Association officially recognized eco-anxiety as a chronic fear of environmental doom. For millennials, this isn't abstract. They're the generation that will live through the worst of climate change. They're making decisions about whether to have children based partly on what kind of world those children would inherit. That's not normal historical context for family planning. And after all of this, after navigating economic collapse, unprecedented debt, a fundamentally changed job market, housing costs that make homeownership a fantasy, delayed life milestones, climate anxiety, and the pressure of performing their lives on social media, society looks at millennials and goes, "Why are you so anxious? And why can't you just buy a house?" The disconnect is staggering. It's like watching someone run an obstacle course designed by sadists and then criticizing them for looking tired. The psychology of millennials becomes incredibly predictable when you look at what they've been through. They're responding exactly how humans respond when the landscape shifts beneath them and the map they were given no longer matches the territory. They're stressed because the conditions are stressful. They're anxious because the future is genuinely uncertain. They're cynical because optimism got them into debt and a job market that treats them as disposable. What's actually remarkable isn't that millennials are struggling, it's that they're still trying. They're still showing up, building businesses, creating art, fighting for change, and attempting to make the world better despite having every reason to give up. That's not weakness. That's resilience under conditions that would have broken previous generations. If this hit home for you, please subscribe. And if you want to support these deep dives, hit that join button to become a channel member. I genuinely appreciate it.